The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ralph Tycho of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I'd like to introduce another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by the Package Tourist in the magical mystery tour called Life, Mathew DiBiase, who tonight will be interviewing author and football historian Joe Zagorski, who will be discussing his second book, The Year the Packers Came Back, Green Bay's 1972 Resurgence.
Thank you, Ralph. Tonight, history will be made. For the first time in the brief history of my podcast, The Package Tourist, I'm having a repeat guest on. And the honor of being my first repeat guest belongs to my dear friend and fellow sports author, Joe Zagorski. Joe has devoted his life to chronicling pro football history, first as a sports writer, then later as a two-time published author with a third book destined to be released later this year. Tonight, we will be discussing his second book, The Year the Packers Came Back, Green Bay's 1972 Resurgence, which was released last November and is available at Amazon. For me personally, interviewing Joe about this specific season, the 1972 season, will bring back many fond childhood memories for me because the 1972 NFL season was the very first NFL season where I developed a love and awareness for NFL football. So for me, interviewing Joe about this season will be a nostalgic journey, not only for Joe, but for myself as well. Joe, what led you to write about this specific season in Green Bay Packers history?
Oh, first of all, Matthew, thank you again for having me on your show. I am honored to be not just a first-time guest, but a second repeat guest. And I just love being on your show. It's great.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. The 72 Packers team, for a number of years, they were on my mind because I'm kind of like you. I started watching football in 1971, but 72 was a season that I really remember. It was one of the first seasons that I was really able to remember it. And I knew that they had gone to the playoffs and they lost their first divisional game to the Washington Redskins, but it just seemed to me that that was a unique team, especially after the decade was over, and I realized, hey, no other Packer team went to the playoffs that entire decade, a whole decade. There was the 78 Packers team that came within a sniffing distance of winning a wild card spot, but they lost their final game of the year to the Los Angeles Rams, and they were, ousted from any chance of getting into the playoffs. But that 72 team, it was a unique team. I just thought that they had a story to tell. They had won 4 games the year before, and then all of a sudden they won 10 games. And back in that time, you had 14 games for a regular season. So you didn't see a whole lot of teams going from that far down in the standings to overnight winning a division title in, of course, a very tough division, the black and blue division, the old NFC Central division, as it was called. It just seemed like it was a pretty interesting team. Little did I know that the more research I did on them, how much adversity they had to overcome in order to win their division title. And so that's primarily what led me to interview more and more players and find out that, there's a story here that needs to be told that hasn't really been told. And so I started writing the book actually a couple of years ago.
Now, Joe, you talk about adversity. Can you please elaborate on that? What type of adversity are we talking about? Can you please specify and elaborate?
Sure. It was primarily internal through the auspices of their head coach, a pretty new head coach. He was only in his second year. His name was Dan Devine. And he pretty much had some crazy ideas, crazy notions as to, for one thing, getting rid of a lot of veteran players who were still in their prime and who knew how to win championships. Quite a few of them have Super Bowl rings from the Lombardi era, and they were still in their prime, quite a few. In fact, some of the ones he got rid of went on to other Super Bowls later on for their next team. And then, some of his roster moves, besides just getting rid of proven veterans, was, the craziest move, as the book points out, was taking an all-pro guard, Gail Gillingham, and moving him from offense to defense less than a week before the first regular season game. This was, I would have to think that everybody in the NFL and writers, you name it, had to be scratching their heads wondering what is going on in Green Bay. Well, unfortunately, Gale got injured right away, injured his knee, was gone for the season by the second week, the regular season, and he was never the same again, unfortunately. They moved. Devine realized his mistake, and, he moved him back to offense, but by then it just was too late, and he never really was the player that he was before. Another problem with Devine, the internal problem, was the stubbornness of the man. Now, we've all seen people who are stubborn, and sometimes it's a good thing to be stubborn, to see a project through, and, but to the point where, at the divisional playoff game against Washington, if you're going to keep running the ball on the same play over and over and over again, and it's getting 1 yard, 0 yards, 1 yard, 0 yards. Who was it that said if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, it's akin to insanity? I forget who said that, but
I know. Yeah, I know Napoleon. Yeah, I know Napoleon once said, "Show me someone who makes the same mistake twice, and I'll show you a fool."
Yeah. And you would not have been far off to define Devine as a fool. In fact, without using that word, many of their players did define him in such a way, especially after the loss to the Redskins in the playoffs, because to a man, just about every one of those guys felt that was a winnable game that they should have won. And you just look at it, and all it would have taken would be just a change in strategy, or better yet, just not, mess with Bart Starr's play calling. And, they had won, I believe it was their last, 3 or 4 games, I think it was, to get into the playoffs and win the division. 3 or 4, I can't remember offhand. And Bart Starr was doing all the play calling. He was doing great. So it was a lot of internal problems, mostly through the head coach, Dan Devine.
So you're saying, now that's interesting. Now Bart Starr, I read the book, but we share with the audience. Now Bart Starr was no longer playing, right? He was just a coach now. Is that true?
That's true. He was his final active season as a player was 1971, and he was kept as a quarterback's coach in 72. And because the Packers had young quarterbacks. They had Scott Hunter, who was in his second year. And they also just drafted, in 72, Jerry Taggy. So they had, a second-year man and a first-year man as quarterbacks. Well, it was a dream thing for both of those two quarterbacks to learn from the great Bart Starr how to be a professional. He has, 5 NFL championships to his credit, including 2 MVP, Super Bowl MVP awards. Who are you going to learn from that's better than that in 1972? So, he was a quarterback's coach at that time. He called the plays, and everything looked fine until right before that playoff game.
When I was a kid, remembering that 72 season, I remember vividly all the talk about when you talked about Green Bay was John Brockington and MacArthur Lane. How potent was that backfield, for the Packers? How great a backfield were they?
It was phenomenal. First of all, they were almost interchangeable. They had the same body type, the same size practically, the same weight practically, and boy, could they could pack a punch. No pun intended, but they were incredibly great blockers for each other. And you would think that with the lack of passing game that the Packers showed in '72, they didn't really light the league on fire through the air, if you know what I mean. Defenses across the league knew, well, Green Bay, all they're going to do is run the ball. Well, try and stop them. Nobody could. I mean, not until the playoffs. But they almost, in the 70s, especially in '72, the hash marks moved in on the field, and that opened up the league to a lot more running and a lot more 1,000-yard rushers. You had Zonka, Kick, and Morris in Green Bay, and they led the entire NFL as a trio of rushing yardage. But Lane and Brockington led the NFC in rushing yardage, not far behind those three runners. And, at least Miami had diversity. They had Paul Warfield outside that Bob Greasy could throw to. They had some good tight ends in Jim Mandich and Marv Fleming. So, they had, and Howard Twilley didn't drop anything. So the Dolphins at least had a passing game that could, the Packers didn't have that. It was all running. They were, I would say that they're the most underappreciated running back duo in NFL history because nobody really talks about them. Yeah, Brockington was the very first player ever to rush for 1,000 yards as a rookie in NFL history. And he did it his first three seasons, 71, 72, and 73. And that's to his credit. He'll go down in history like that. But when he and MacArthur Lane were together, they were a great duo. And John Brockington told me that the worst day he ever had in Green Bay was the day when he found out that MacArthur Lane was traded. He was very depressed from that, and he told me because it just changed everything. And but the '72 Packer running game, boy, were they strong. And here's the caveat of that: both of those guys could catch the ball, and both of those guys rarely fumbled the ball. They were an excellent running duo.
What was Scott Hunter like as a quarterback for that team?
Well, a second-year quarterback, it's hard for any second-year quarterback, no matter what they're asked to do, I would think. You learn what you can learn as a rookie, and he was, thrown into the fire quarterbacking quite a few games in 1971 as a rookie. And he did okay. I didn't, set the league on fire or anything, but I thought that, the term today is called manage the game. I think Scott Hunter would fall under that category. Yes, he handed the ball off a lot. That was his main job, pretty much. But he was able to throw the ball when, he had good mechanics. He was a good quarterback as far as throwing. He threw the winning touchdown pass in the very first meeting with Detroit on Monday Night Football, which the Packers won 24-23. So I'd say he was a game manager, did what he was asked to do, fought through an injury towards the end of the year, and helped to be a catalyst for the team to, win a division title. No, his statistics, didn't win any passing records or anything like that, but he was still a very qualified game manager, and I think 72 was probably his best year.
Who were the key defensive players for the Packers for that great season?
Well, there were quite a few. The defense was really solid, and I would say that, even though in 72, the NFL was a running game for everybody.
Yeah.
It was first and foremost a running game. But you had to be able to, stop, any kind of passing attack that you did see. The Packers defense had a great pass coverage defense. First of all, they got a pretty good rush. You had guys like Mike McCoy. You had Bob Brown as a defensive tackle tandem. They had just gotten Alden Roche in a trade, and he had a good year. Clarence Williams on the other defensive end position, he had a very good year. In fact, he had 3 sacks of Fran Tarkenton in that division clinching game in December.
Wow.
Dave Robinson on the outside linebacker, Hall of Famer, eventual Hall of Famer, and of course Super Bowl champion. Even though he didn't play a whole lot, Ray Nitschke was still on the team. Jim Carter was the middle linebacker, the other middle linebacker. Fred Carr was a great outside linebacker who never gets the credit that he deserves today. He was a spirited middle linebacker who could hit like a freight train, cover really well, and he was really kind of unique in that he wore one of those quarterbacks double bar face masks all throughout his career as an outside linebacker. I guess it helped his sight a lot better than one of those cage face masks. But where the Packers defense was really sound was in the defensive secondary. And you couldn't predict it because they were so young and so inexperienced. You had a brand new rookie, Willie Buchanan, who became the rookie of the year for defense in the NFL as a starting cornerback as a rookie. They have a term for it now, shutdown corner, where he would take the best receiver of your opponent and just shut them down. That was Buchanan. And on the other side, a cornerback who was just as good was Kenny Ellis, who had one of his best seasons ever. And in the safeties, you had Al Matthews and Jim Hill, who just came in from a trade. And Jim Hill had a few years underneath his belt of experience. They all had it seemingly just about the best year that you could imagine that a defensive secondary could have. I believe they permitted, get this, 7 touchdown passes the entire year. Try doing that today. You got that Mahomes kid in Kansas City can almost throw 7 touchdown passes in a game if you give him enough protection. So can you imagine limiting an offense for 14 games to 7 touchdown passes? Phenomenal.
I know.
Just phenomenal.
I mean, I like to give a shout out to our younger listeners because, just to let you know how old the two of us are. I mean, back 50 years ago, the NFL football, today, it's pass, and you run a little bit just to set up the pass. The old days, kids, it was run, and you threw a couple of times just to help set up your run. So talk about the flipping 180-degree turn in NFL tactics, you younger kids.
and Vince Lombardi wouldn't recognize today's game because he said, before he passed away, he said that football is first and foremost a running game, and that will never change. Well, it has changed. And he wouldn't. But I say this: even though he wouldn't recognize what it has become today, I still think he'd be successful.
Absolutely. There was another key rookie in that 72 season, and you talk about him in the book. How important was place kicker Chester Markle? Wasn't he the first soccer-style kicker in Green Bay Packers history?
Now, that I don't know. I know Pete Gogolak was the first soccer-style kicker in pro football history, and he kicked in the AFL first. I forget.
Yeah, but I'm talking about Packers franchise history.
I would have to say you're correct because I don't remember seeing any other previous kicker kick anything but straight on. Even Dave Robinson did some kicking for Lombardi. It's really incredible. But Chester Markle, he came to the, and he was part of the how would you say, the rookie class of '72, where Dan Devine actually did not make a mistake in drafting him. When he drafted him, they didn't know that he was going to lead the league in points his very first year. I mean, could you have imagined that? I mean, he didn't even know it, but you could get close to midfield, and this guy was going to kick you 3 points, and you get a few of those in the game, and all of a sudden with that defense, well, that's how they won 10 games.
Joe, tell me, was Marco one of the reasons why the NFL moved the goalpost back from the goal line to the end of the end zone? Was that because wasn't '72 the very last season where the goalposts were right there on the goal line? Am I correct, or was that the following season when they, or '74? I forget. Was it '73 or '74 they pushed back the goalposts?
It was 74. 73 was the last year that they had the goalpost right up there. I don't think it was so much Marco as it was the fact that the goalpost was getting in the way.
Yeah.
Super Bowl VII, Billy Kilmer had Jerry Smith of the Redskins lined up for a touchdown. He had the ball was going right to him, and Jerry Smith didn't drop anything, but the goalpost knocked the ball down. And that
I remember that. I remember that like it was yesterday. But the thing was, though, I remember a Football Digest article talked about it, and they were talking about that '72, '73. You were seeing the field goal kickers were becoming so accurate. You had Chester Markle, you had Roy Girella, Tony Fritsch, and Jan Stenerud. It was becoming so automatic. They decided they wanted. I think that's one of the reasons why they pushed it back, because the kicking accuracy was going right through the roof.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Because I remember Football Digest talked about that. Actually, they mentioned Mark Cole about that as well. I remember reading that as a kid, but it's just, but I remember that, though. It's just talk about vintage football.
Didn't you love when the mailman dropped off your monthly Football Digest? God, I love that. That was great.
I still have them. I didn't have it for long. I mean, I only have a bare handful of them. I don't even think we had a subscription. I think what we used to do was my father used to take me to the Berlin auction, and they had a great magazine stand there. It was almost like every other weekend, and the latest Football Digest would be there, and we'd always get it. So I had a subscription to Baseball Digest, but I don't think I had a regular subscription to Football Digest, or maybe it was just for a year I had that. But I still have them all. I do. I never threw them away. I still got them all, man.
Yeah, well, I'm with you. I used a lot of them. I looked at a lot of them for my first book, the NFL in the 1970s, because let's face it, the 1970s was when Football Digest was really, really good. That was its first decade, and so I believe it came out in '71. I think it was the first year. I could be wrong about that. It was either 70 or 71, but I love reading that. But the '72 Packers, they're just an incredible team. I just didn't think that there was ever a team quite like them that had to deal with what they had to deal with and yet still win a division title.
Getting back to the season, you talk about this in the book. Back then, this is when the seasons were only 14 games, kids, instead of 16 games. I mean, this is how long. This is ancient history we're talking about, youngsters. If you're listening.
And 6 preseason games.
That's right. Yeah. Regular season didn't start till 72 was September 17th of all things. What were they thinking in the old days?
They had a lot more rookies because the draft went on for over 12 rounds sometimes. So they had a lot more rookies to look at. Training camps had to last longer. And, of course, now we know we're trying to shorten training camps because the players are getting hurt. So
yeah, and there's no bye week either, man.
No.
Getting back to it, now the first 7 weeks of the season, the Packers are only 4-3. Now, you talk about this in the book. After that loss to Minnesota in Week 7, didn't you say there was like a sort of like a team meeting or like a private gathering among the players that they had to get it together? Can you elaborate on that? I mean, was there like a meeting of some sort or like a private understanding amongst the players?
It was a little bit. It was, today we almost every team that goes on to the playoffs, later on you hear, well, we had this team meeting and, it was a good team meeting. Dave Robinson told me that they had a team meeting. He was the only one that really expanded on it. And he said that instead of, he wasn't talking about like they were saying, we got to shore up our defense or we got to start running the ball. No, he said, what we need to have is more parties. So that's what they did. They started having more cookouts and things like that. And as it turned out, there was one player on the team, I can't remember, I think could have been Kenny Ellis, who liked to eat raccoons. And so the people in Wisconsin they found out, they got wind of this and they started hunting raccoons. And Dave Robinson said it was a good luck symbol. It had nothing. The team meeting and the subsequent following team meetings weren't really to talk about strategy or anything or to get motivated or anything. It was to play cards and have some bratwurst and some raccoons and stuff.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
They bonded, they bonded. But John Brockington told me that they bonded almost immediately. But when the season started. And so, the team meeting of 72 that idea was pretty much just an addition to the bonding, and it just solidified it more.
Talk about now, again, after a Week 11 loss to the Redskins, the Packers, it was kind of the race for the NFC Central was pretty tight, and then you were talking about actually, I'm looking at the record right now. They won their last 3 games of the season. Clutch wins against Detroit, Minnesota, New Orleans to clinch the Central. Again, can you talk about that little stretch there, that 3-game winning streak where they were able to cement the division? How important were those games against Detroit and Minnesota?
The game against Detroit gets ignored pretty much because the game against Minnesota was the division clincher. But the game against Detroit, you had, first of all, it was at Lambeau Field. It was the last game of the year at Lambeau Field, and it was freezing. It was just a little bit warmer than the Minnesota game 7 days later. But there were injuries that the team had. Ken Ellis was still fighting an injury, as was Jim Hill, and Scott Hunter was still not 100%. So no one really was sure. They had beaten the Lions earlier in the year up in Detroit by 1 point. And the players knew, hey, we need to win this game. But the thing is that Ken Ellis, even though he was hurt, decided to play. And that inspired the team quite a bit because they figured, you know what, this guy really wants this bad. Of course, Dan Devine, had the caveat that, you know what, I might not allow him to play. But right before the game, he said, okay, give it a shot. Let's see how you do. And Ken Ellis intercepted 2 passes against Detroit. And that really, it changed momentum. And the passes he intercepted, he took them inside Detroit territory. Scott Hunter ran in for, I believe, 2 touchdowns. I know at least 1. And the team just dominated the Lions. They had a 33-0 lead very late in the game, and I think it was like the second to the last play of the game when Detroit finally scored on a touchdown pass to Ron Jesse. So the final was 33-7. But that would have given Green Bay, if they could have stopped that touchdown pass, that could have tied the all-time NFL record of just 6 touchdown passes permitted in a whole year. So, the Detroit game was really important. Now, of course, like I said, everybody remembers the Minnesota game. They had lost to the Vikings earlier in the year. It was a must-win game. It was a must-win game for the Vikings too. If the Vikings lose, they've lost the division. Green Bay has won the division. So both teams certainly had a purpose to win this game. Very, very cold weather. A lot of stories involved with the cold weather that are in the book. Scott Hunter has a lot of fun stories to tell about it. So does John Brockington. And the Packers are losing 7-0 at halftime. And the running attack, which is so feared, only got around 50-some yards in that first half, which is far below their average. So, and I'm thinking, well, how are they going to react to losing 7-0? It was almost like it was like no big deal. Scott Hunter and John Brockington both told me, okay, you got a 7-0 lead on us. So what? There's still 30 minutes left to play. Sure enough, the 7 points was all Minnesota was going to get because the Packers started getting some turnovers. And interceptions and fumble recoveries, taking them deep into Minnesota territory. MacArthur Lane pops off a big run, cuts back and runs for like 37 yards. They're in territory again. Willie Buchanan intercepts a couple of key passes. John Brockington is able to get over 100 yards. Before you know it, it's 23-7, and Dan Devine is getting a victory ride to his first ever division title. The game against New Orleans, the final game of the year at New Orleans, kind of like a reward for winning the division. You got a chance to rest a lot of regulars. Brockington didn't play much in that game, but he played long enough to, eclipse the 1,000-yard barrier. Scott Hunter says that they wanted him to get his bonus in his contract if he got over 1,000, so they kept him in the game long enough to get his bonus. But the Packers had a lot of second and third stringers playing in that New Orleans game, and it turns out they gave up a couple of touchdown passes to Archie Manning. The Packers actually could have given up just 4 touchdown passes that whole year if they would have stopped Detroit 2 weeks prior, and if they could have kept their regulars in throughout that whole New Orleans game. But a lot of the, from what I've heard, they just didn't want to risk injury. Once they got a pretty comfortable lead on New Orleans, in the second half, it was second and third stringers for the most part. There were, of course, still some starters in because the rosters were only 40, I think it was 40 guys at that time. So you had to have some first stringers in. But, they won the game. They won the game 30-20, and off they were to Washington to the playoffs. And it was a reward. The New Orleans win was kind of like a reward for all they had been through, and it was nice to get double digits in your win column to win the NFC Central in 72.
Let's get back to that sad loss to the Washington Redskins in the first round of the 72 playoffs. Now, in your book, you talk about Washington came up with a rather unique defensive system to combat the Green Bay Packers. Would you please tell our listeners, what exactly did the Redskins do to stymie the Green Bay Packers running game? What did they do? Well,
in the first game, they had played the Packers earlier in the year, and Green Bay lost that game 21-16. And George Allen, the head coach of the Redskins, who was also in his second year as a head coach of the Redskins, like Dan Devine was in his second year. Well,
yep.
George Allen decided, let's take out our middle linebacker and let's replace him with a defensive lineman, giving us 5 defensive linemen. I don't know the origins of why he decided to do this, but I guess it was just to try and cover up any potential holes that the defensive line for Washington might have had because the Packers are a running team. Well, it worked a little bit, but they didn't stay in it in that regular season game. And so, they scrapped it for the rest of that regular season game, which they still managed to win against the Packers 21-16. So George Allen has an idea. You know what? Let's try it again. If it doesn't work, we'll get out of it. So they try it, and it works again. And they said, you know what? The Packers are still trying to run the ball against it, and they're not succeeding. You've got Manny Sistrunk, who at that time wasn't even a starter, but he was healthy. He was rested. He was about 260 pounds, 265 pounds maybe, and he was going up against the center for the Packers at that time. Ken Bowman was just like 245 pounds. Well, Manny Sistrunk had probably his best game of his career in that game, and he was just stopping everything. He was, Bowman just couldn't block him. Okay, well, Dan Devine at that time decides, you know what, I'm going to call plays instead of Bart Starr. There is conjecture as to when Devine decided on this. Some of the players told me it was a few days before the game. Some said it was the night before the game, and still others said it was right before kickoff. Regardless of when it was, Bart Starr he didn't have the authority to call plays anymore. This was the biggest blunder, the biggest mistake of the 72 season, even worse than moving Gail Gillingham to the defensive side of the ball. Because it just, like Brockington told me, John Brockington said, all we needed to do was to send both of the running backs out across the middle on pass routes. Scott Hunter could hit that pass, 10 out of 10 times because there's no middle linebacker there. One of the running backs is going to take an outside linebacker deep, and all you have to do is just loft the ball over the defensive line, and the other running back's going to catch it, and there ain't going to be nobody that's going to stop him for at least 20 yards. George Allen is a smart enough coach to realize that if that were to happen, Manny Sistrunk would find his way back to the bench post-haste. And so that didn't happen because Dan Devine and his stubbornness, and that's what happened. You had Dan Devine saying, nope, I'm going to call the plays, and I'm going to call this play a dive run like you would call at the goal line, at the 1 yard line, over and over again. The frustration 40-some years later, John Brockington was, I talked to him over the phone. I couldn't go out to California to interview him in person, but you could just hear his frustration even after so many years about how frustrated he was. And that was George Allen went to a five-man defensive line. That's what ultimately won the game for him. Dave Robinson told Scott Hunter, look, if you can somehow score 20 points, you're going to win this game because our defense isn't going to give up 20. And that's what happened. The Redskins only got 16 points. And even in 72, that was a winnable game. Chester Markole, he kicked a field goal for the Packers, but that's all they could get was one field goal. And to ask Scott Hunter to be able to, he had to have been pretty frustrated, handing the ball off on the same play over and over again when he knows the team isn't going to, move the ball any further. And then you're in a 3rd and 10 a lot of times. You're just not going to win.
Joe, when we talked last month, when I interviewed you about your upcoming Willie Lanier book, you were telling me about your background. You told me you were born and raised in Pennsylvania. However, interestingly, you became a devoted Green Bay Packers fan. How did that come about, Joe? Why the transition, to being a Green Bay Packers fan? Can you tell us that?
It's kind of unique. I think the fact that you're not going to believe this, but you're in my age range. I don't know. Do you remember the Sears and the J.C. Penney's Christmas catalogs?
Yep.
Do you remember?
Absolutely.
do you remember the fact that you had all these kids in the NFL section where NFL properties was finally coming about, where these kids are wearing these helmets and jerseys? I just love that Packers uniform. So that was the birth of my devotion to the Packers. But it was solidified when I got a chance to meet and interview Bart Starr. I don't know if you ever had a chance to talk to Bart Starr.
No, sadly. I read the little pocket bios of him as a little kid, That thing that came out was in the mid-'60s, about his life and playing career as that little pocket bio. But no, I never had the great honor and privilege of interviewing or interviewing Bart Starr. So if you got to meet him, you're one up on me, Joe, and I envy you for it. But go ahead, continue.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to tell you the story of when I did meet him, because it's an incredible story. I was writing for the Coatesville Daily Record newspaper. I was a sports writer there. And my boss at the time, he said, do you have anything to do tonight? And I said, I don't have anything lined up. All my stuff is already in. And he goes, would you mind driving to Philadelphia? I need you to interview somebody. And I said, okay, no worries. He goes, here's a ticket to Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia. Is it still standing, to the luxury box up top? I said, I've never been in there before. Yeah, I'll go. Who do I have to interview? He goes, Bart Starr. I almost died. I think it's, it's like
man. Far out, man. Far out. Oh, you lucky duck, you lucky duck, you.
Well, Bart Starr, his long past, he wasn't a coach anymore. He had retired as a coach for the Packers, but he was in Philadelphia to win an award of some sort. I think it was the Ernie Davis Award. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And so I thought, oh my gosh, I'm thinking this is pro football royalty. I can't wait to go. So I drove really fast and of course ignored the speed limit. The speed limit was a mere suggestion on that night. I had to drive really, really fast because I wanted to meet Bart Starr. So I go in there and I go in the box and somebody from the Philadelphia Inquirer is interviewing him, but there he is. There's Bart Starr. So I wait till the other writer is done interviewing him, and I go up and I, introduce myself. Hi, Mr. Starr. He goes, oh, please call me Bart. So informal. So,
wow.
And I'm asking him all these questions that I know he has heard hundreds of times, but he treats me as if like it's the first time he's heard anybody ask him these, questions on his career. Such a humble and incredible man. But the story gets even better. One of his handlers who was there says, you're being asked to go down one level. There's like a little TV studio there, and we need you. We need Bart for a taping with Herb Adderley. And I'm thinking,
wow.
Holy cow! And I said, so I imposed upon the handler. I said, do you mind if I go with you guys? And he goes, no. And it was one of the few times that I was wearing a suit, because it was like, I said, I'm so glad I wore a suit. And so Here I am walking down this hallway in Vet Stadium with Bart Starr and his handlers like I'm in the entourage. And I'm thinking, holy cow, this is like, I'm important for once. So we get there and Bart sees Herb and they hug each other, and Herb and Bart are sitting in front of, the cameras, getting interviewed and stuff. And I thank the handlers and stuff. And after that, the handler says to me, would you like me to take your photo with Bart and Herb? And of course I brought a camera along. And I'm thinking, is the sky dark at night? Yes, I want you to take a photo. I would love it.
Beautiful,
so
beautiful.
I got a photo from my own camera, 35 millimeter of me and Bart Starr and Herb Adderley. And I figured, all right, this is great. But it gets even better. I figured, well, I still got this pass. It was during the summer. It was at a Phillies baseball game. Why are we here? I'm not being required to write about the baseball game, so I'll just go back up to the luxury box and sit down and watch some baseball. So I go there and I sit down. 5 minutes later, guess who sits next to me? Bart Starr and Herb Adderley. It's incredible. And it's like they're talking to me as if I'm a buddy, and they're talking to me for an hour. We're back and forth. And I am not kidding. It's incredible.
I believe you. Yes, I believe you. That's Bart.
So,
I mean, yeah. Yeah.
But to go, this just goes to show the measure of that man. He was so humble, a complete stranger, and he talked to me, and Herb did, as if I was just a buddy of theirs. So Bart's leaving, and I'm leaving, and I figured, you know what, I'm just going to follow them, just see where Bart goes, because I'm not, Bart has to catch a flight. I don't. And so he's walking out of the stadium, and a ticket taker notices him. Hey, you're Bart Starr. Don't you know Bart Starr stood there and talked to this complete stranger for 10 minutes? And you know how incredible. I mean, do you think Troy Aikman or Tom Brady would do that to? I don't know. I mean, I've never met them, so I don't know. But I've heard stories like that about Bart Starr. That I have heard dozens of stories just like that. Just an incredible man, and I'm so honored. It's so much the better to have met him one time. Very humble man, very incredible man. And just every time I go to the Hall of Fame, I make sure I go and see his bust, because he's just an incredible guy. And I know Heaven got a heck of a quarterback when he passed away just earlier last year. So
I just like to say this about the late Bart Starr. In an era where you see athletes of all the major sports, either behaving badly or controversially or outrageously, Bart Starr knew he was a football hero, and he accepted that responsibility for being a football hero, and not once did he ever shirk that responsibility for being a football hero. And I think that is what made Bart Starr the great quarterback that he was and the great human being that he was. Do you feel the same way, Joe?
Oh, without a doubt. There is just no way that I can disagree with that sentiment. He embodied the athlete, the professional athlete, of not just, the 60s. And the 60s was a strange decade because you had athletes that were quite different. Joe Namath, of course, is one. Sonny Jurgensen. But Bart Starr, he didn't get the attention that a lot of great quarterbacks got at that time or get even today. But 5 world championships in 7 years, that's greatness. Yep. Just the man to be able to be humble to the point, like you said, he knew he was important, but he loved to talk to the common man because he was that in his heart. And he was just, you're never going to find a better man. I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of people who could probably never list, besides their own fathers, somebody who is better than Bart Starr. That's a heck of a legacy.
Okay, Joe, last question. Now, I know that your book is available at Amazon. Is this book, the year the Packers came back, Green Bay's 1972 Resurgence, available at stores like, off the shelf at stores like at Barnes & Nobles and other bookstores? Can you buy it in a bookstore, or do you have to buy it online on Amazon?
Sadly, no, it's not available. It's only available online, but it's available on websites like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, It's also available through the publisher, McFarlane and Company Incorporated. That's the only way. Oh, and eBay. You can get it on eBay.
Okay.
Those are the only ways that you can buy it, unfortunately. But like a friend of mine, Michael McCambridge, has told me, most books are selling online anyway. A lot of people don't go to bookstores anymore; they buy online.
Yep.
So that's it's only available online. So and pretty soon it's going to be available in the Kindle version, electronic versions. It's not yet available on those versions yet. It's only available in the print version right now. But I think it's a good book. I think the story, I mean, it's not so much my writing as it is the story. The story is unique. It's you have to read it to kind of believe that this could have happened. I don't know if it can happen today, but I think a lot of head coaches today, Freddie Kitchens in Cleveland, hired and fired within 1 year. So there are good coaches and bad coaches. Dan Devine was part of the reason why I wrote this book. In the back of my mind, I was kind of wondering, could he have been that bad of a head coach? Was there anybody that could say anything good about him? So I was kind of looking to balance the scales and try to find somebody to say something good about him. And I'll leave that as a tease to get people to buy it.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you so much for coming on, and I really appreciate just listening to you talk. Just brings back so many memories of that 1972 season, and I know I want you on my show again, in the months to come, and months and years to come, because when you think about it, for the 2020s, we're talking like, 60th anniversary of, Lombardi's first championship game appearance, against the Eagles, and then the next year will be his first championship in '62. 22 will be the '62 championship. So I want you on. We got to do a retrospective about the great glory years of Lombardi. I want you on, okay, Joe?
Oh, okay. Well, I got to do some studying then, Mathew. But hey, it was an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to be on your show again. And I look forward to my third visit.
That's right. Well, it's September when the next season, 2020 season starts. It'll be the 50th anniversary of the first NFL season as a merger with the NFC and AFC. And we'll talk about your very first book, your history of the NFL in the 1970s. We're going to talk about that, okay?
Hey, I'd love to. That's my favorite decade.
You got it. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show where I will be interviewing football author Tommy Phillips. Thank you and good night.
Okay. I guess we're clear. Thanks, Mathew.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices, and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.